Good morning, everybody. My name is Rich Sloma. Welcome to today's New York State Archives presentation of Managing Social Media Records. Today's presenters are Sarah Durling and Michael Martin. The session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box to the right side of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. And at this point in time, I will turn the presentation over to Michael.
Okay, thank you very much, Rich. Okay, aha, now we're moving along here. All right, as Rich said, my name is Michael Martin, and both Sarah and I have the pleasure of being records advisory officers to help people all over the state answer their records management questions. So one of the biggest questions or issues that we face is the ever expanding role social media plays within organizations, local governments, state agencies, you name it. Everybody kind of has their toe in this water. Today, Sarah and I are going to talk about what to do with all of these records that are being created. So here's kind of a good breakdown of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to talk about the purpose and risk of social media. We all know the basic idea of why we want to reach out, but what are the risks associated when your organization does this? We'll also talk about the challenges of records management and social media. I mean, of course there are challenges, right? But knowing about them ahead of time can help you avoid being caught in the middle of them and kind of wonder, hey, what just happened? Talk about planning for social media. And when we're talking about that, we want to make sure that everybody has a good way to avoid that kind of confusion. If you have a plan ahead of time, you know what you want, and maybe more importantly, what you don't want your social media to do for you. And that is all part of that planning. Some policies and procedures for social media. Knowing what you want helps you write down exactly what other people need to do or not to do, as the case may be. People often ask, what about this or that? Can we do this or that? And the first question that we always ask is, do you have policies and procedures in place? These are critical. Talk about records retention for social media because everyone is, creating these records, all these kinds of records. So the big question is, which ones need to be kept? And then the follow-up for that is, and for how long? And then managing social media records. We're going to talk about how to get your arms kind of around these records and make sure you're keeping them as needed. So as you can see, we got a pretty full menu going on today. All right, so the first step is to figure out what we're talking about here. All right, this point, we probably have a pretty good idea of what social media is, okay? We've all had an opportunity to play with the new fun and cool toys and apps and platforms that are out there. This slide, probably needs to be updated because you can see the bluebird of Twitter has gone the way of, X, and there have definitely been changes, but it gives you an idea of all the different things that are out there. Some are more considered more professional and others are not. There's all different kinds of, flavors and tastes when it comes to social media. But there's always new ones being churned out, and you have to be aware of all the different things that are out there. In the end, this is what it comes down to. It's another form of communication between you and others. And, if you want some official definitions, there's a whole bunch on the side here. You can see some examples, but the main things that come across are these are interactive, they're network, some kind of network that you're working within, and it is user created content. And that's what's important is that you are creating the content to share. So just a brief kind of history of what social media kind of is, brief overview timeline. It goes all the way back to the 19th century and the introduction of the telegraph. Then we can jump a few steps going past, wireless technology and everything else, all the way to the 1960s, dealing with excuse me, the ARPA nets, that sort of thing. Then we jump all the way to the 1990s, and well, some people remember the explosion of the internet when that came in the 1990s and it first burst on the scene. Here we're talking about the days of AOL and Yahoo and GeoCities, and then after that, social media starting to take over in the early 2000s with MySpace and Facebook, Wikipedia, Twitter, YouTube, and most of these are still around. Then you have, the changes for things like Instagram and Pinterest and a few that Mark Zuckerberg and Meta hasn't bought out yet. So the question is, what is next? All right. What is going to be the next thing that comes after 2024? Well, we don't know exactly what's coming next. We can kind of look back and see the changes that social media has brought on society and local governments and state agencies and all organizations, really. But we do know that there's a really good chance that people are going to continue to want to use these to interact with you and your organization. So then the next question is, why are governments using social media? Government and all different kinds of organizations. Well, they may have different reasons, but here are some of the main ones that we've seen. You want to demonstrate government transparency. This day and age, transparency is very important, and you can seem open and approachable via social media. It also allows you to interact with citizens. People can ask you questions and get quick answers. It allows you to share news. Everyone is happy to post a press release and get out that information quickly. It can also cut back on those routine calls and the routine emails and asks when the answers are already out there. And it fosters citizen participation. People get their opinions out there. How are people going to know about, that the trash pickup is on the other side of the road, or it's not going to be picked up on holidays, or give them a chance to have some feedback on a new policy if you don't give them the chance to voice their opinions and thoughts? So there are plenty of reasons why to use social media, but there are many questions that come with it. And Sarah will talk about these.
Thanks, Michael. So, I have what might be a somewhat scary question for some folks. Do you know what social media your government is using? And, it is okay if you don't. But if you want to throw it in the chat, I'm always wildly curious as to what different organizations are using because as Michael said, everybody has a different set of needs with their social media and responsibilities. So, for example, there may be agencies and governments that find it useful to reach out to folks on Pinterest still, because that's where the audience that they're looking for is. So it's always just kind of interesting to know what you're up to and what you're using. And so that we can actually kind of try to tailor our advice to the tools that are currently popular. And Facebook is kind of one of those universally popular ones. I kind of figure a lot of folks are going to be using Facebook and Twitter, or X as it's currently called. LinkedIn, that's cool. I hadn't really thought about that one. But yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of different venues that you could be using potentially. And we're seeing, I don't want to say a seismic shift in how social media is being um, the new social media sites are being created and used, but it's interesting to watch right now, and let's put it that way. So for all of the advantages and reasons that you want to use social media that Michael talked about, there are some decided risks associated with them. Because depending on how you're set up for social media, it can create some. Not knowing what you have or having no real control over it, no policies, procedures associated with it, can open you up to a whole bunch of concerns over time. Social media, depending on how it's set up, can also open up you to some vulnerability to cyber attacks, depending on how well your security is set up, whether people reuse passwords and they shouldn't. It just gives you folks another venue to access your staff and your constituency. If you don't have policies and procedures in place and you don't have a whole lot of control over what's being posted, that can lead to public embarrassment when something gets out there that hopefully wouldn't have gotten out there otherwise. Something gets posted using the language that you wouldn't have chosen to use, is incorrect information. It doesn't inspire confidence in your government and in your ability to lead, among other things. People often don't consider the social media to have records on them, so they don't really start managing them. They don't treat them as records. And you end up with an inability to produce official records for a lot of reasons when they're requested if you don't understand what you have and aren't managing it well. Whether you can't access an account because you don't have control over it or because a system went down. Most of these are hosted on third parties with third parties. So if somebody shuts down their system without warning, you might lose access to records that are already out there. I know, I know. They are records. This is a concept that not everybody has really clicked to yet. And that's fine because really social media in our day-to-day use is very ephemeral in a lot of ways. You're using it to check up on what your neighbors are doing, make sure that mom is still okay and not and posting pictures of the family to Facebook, that sort of thing. But when it comes to the government, they really can be records that you are going to be responsible for managing. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why they might not be managed or managed well. First and foremost, they're not seen as records because you don't know, oh yeah, they're things that are created and received in the course of business. Therefore, they may be that need to be managed. Or they're not a high priority for you. Your payroll is a high priority. Your personnel records are a high priority. The things that are critical to your mission are a high priority for you to get control of and manage. Social media, it's out there, but it's not going anywhere. We can get to it. It'll be fine. It does add to your workload because goodness knows it's very rare to see rights management as a sole job out in the local governments and state agencies. Usually it's tacked on to the 18,000 other things that you guys are out there doing as another part of your job. So when other things are on fire, this is not the thing that you are focused on. There might be a lack of knowledge, whether you just don't know what's being used, or social media is just not something that you're into, so it's not really something you understand. Um, and there might be inherent technical challenges around it too, because there's IT considerations to address for some of these. So what you want from your social media within your organization, within your government, within your agency is social media that is used intentionally. It is set up and managed in a largely centralized fashion by your government, whether you have one social media set of sites that you're using that you've set up for the entire government, or depending on how your government functions, how your agency functions, set up specifically for certain departments where you know that they have access to them, that you know that these accounts exist, and that there are limited authorized users for these accounts. These are the people that are allowed to post to them. Suzanne, Lewis, Dwayne, these are the folks who have access to these accounts. And so that we know that they know what they need to post to it and that you can access these accounts if you need to. That these accounts are owned and accessible by your government, that somebody hasn't just booted up an account and is running around wild talking about their job in an official capacity, and you have no ability to get into those records. Likewise, you also don't want an account that's been abandoned as well. That if you're using these tools to interact with the public, that you are monitoring them, and that if somebody DMs you or somebody leaves you a message, you are responding to those appropriately. That you can get records out of these accounts, that you can manage them as needed. Some of them have built-in tools, some of them require third-party tools to access them, and we will talk about that later. But you want to make sure that you know how to get these in and out, and that there is minimal original content in your social media, and that these are typically not going to be the official copy of your records. Now, Sarah, what's an official copy of a record? Let me get you covered on this. A record for our intents and purposes here today is any information that is created or received by a government in the course of business. So when you're using social media, you're working in the course of business, potentially creating records. The official copy of a record is the one copy of a record that has to be maintained for the length of its retention period. So to think of a non-social media example of this, say you have a memo that's created within your offices and it gets distributed to folks. The official copy of the memo is probably going to live with the person who created it. That's the copy that is going to have to be held on to for however long the retention period says it does. Everybody else who has a copy has a duplicate, and those duplicates can be discarded when they're no longer needed. To take this principle and move it to your social media, if you have an announcement like, oh my gosh, we just got hit by all of the snow in Erie, off of Erie, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and nobody is going to work or school today, and you want to post that on your Facebook page, you may choose to create a file, a Word file, write it up, get it approved as a Word file, and then copy that information to your social media, your X, your Facebook, whatever. Your official copy of that may be the original file that you've created the message on. And then what's on your social media is considered to be copies and are not the official copy. Things that you do not want, that you desperately do not want when you are working social media as records. You do not want anybody in your government to be able to start an official account. I have heard all sorts of interesting stories in the last few years of folks where a bunch of different departments all created official accounts, but they're not designated. Nobody is quite sure who has access to them, and there's no unified messaging going across them. Or you have had some sort of government executive, a board member, a supervisor, a mayor, a commissioner who boots up a personal account, but uses that as their official account, acting in their official capacity. But they have, the government itself has no access to that, only the person who has started that account. And that is not ideal, because those are, if they're acting in an official capacity, those are going to be government records that you are going to have to deal with. Again, you don't want abandoned accounts that are inaccessible to your government. Look at the chat. There's a bunch of different social media tools being used. And, you're going to keep an eye on them and analyze them and figure out, are they really worth the bang for the buck? And I mean, generally, they don't cost anything to use other than your staff time and resources. But if you're not getting the results from using the social media tool, maybe you don't need to use it anymore. You drop that account and leave it out there and then suddenly no longer be able to access it when there's still a records in. So you want to make sure that you are keeping track of these things and managing them appropriately as you are to use them. You don't want unmonitored in responses to public interaction out there. If you have your comments on, if you have your DMs open, and somebody says, hey, I need help, you don't want them hanging out there without a response. It looks bad. It reduces the trust in your government that you are able to do what you're doing, able to do the things that you're supposed to do. Even if you have a simple response like, hey, we're not taking in answering questions here for this sort of thing, please reach out to this email address or this phone numbers to get the assistance you need, is better than just leaving it without responding at all. You don't want to not be able to retrieve records from social media accounts as needed. If you get hit with a discovery question, if you get hit with a FOIL request, you want to be able to get that information. So you need to have control over those accounts. And again, like we were just talking about, if at all humanly possible, you do not want your original content to live solely on your social media. And we're going to give this back to Michael.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so now this may be kind of hard to do at this point, but if you can, you always want to try to stay ahead of any new social media tools that your government wants to use. And you want to plan for your social, you want to plan your social media. You want to manage your records before their creation, ideally. So you have to think about what you are creating before you start using social media. At least give it a thought. Then you want to create some social media plans and policies and procedures beforehand. It's always best to create something ahead of time. We'll talk about the details of the plan in a few moments. Sarah mentioned a few things that we suggest as well. But remember, you want to have a plan in place before you do anything. If you didn't do this ahead of time, don't worry, it's not the end of the world, but it is important to try to set up a plan now. Okay, so you need a team, right? We cannot say this enough. You cannot and should not do all of this alone. You need to have all of the major stakeholders involved in this planning, from management to every. So you want to have your public relations involved. They're probably going to be creating a lot of your content. Your legal counsel, so that they, can write off, sign off on whatever is being posted. Of course, you're going to need your information technology involved. They're either going to help you post the information, or they're going to help ensure that the information is being saved in some way, shape, or form. So it doesn't matter whether you have a single person, you have a department, or you work with a vendor. Your information technology has got to be involved as part of this team when you're starting to set up for planning. Your records management folks need to be involved because we are creating records, of course, and of course other affected units. And when we're saying that, it means everybody. Everybody's got to be kind of involved because everybody's probably going to want to have a say as part of this. So now we're going to talk about some specific elements of a plan. Okay, so there's some basic elements that you want to make sure that you have part of your plan. What is the intent or purpose? Somebody wants to use social media, that's all well and good, but why? What is the intent? What is the purpose? What are you looking for? Are you looking for more interaction or feedback, or you just want to put out information as quickly as possible? You need to think about that. You want to set some goals, right? You want to make sure that these goals are set. How many people will have access? How much is too much or too little for a post? What are you looking for as part of your goals? Are you looking for followers? Are you looking for likes in this case? What do you do when you reach your goal? Do you move forward or not? Those are the kind of things you have to have a plan for. What content? Will you just put out announcements, or will you actually provide an opportunity for people to express their ideas and opinions on things? Think about that as well. What platforms are you going to use? Are you going to use Facebook? Are you going to use X or Twitter? It's a whole bunch of different things. Maybe TikTok is your style. Whatever it is you decide to use, you need to think about that. Okay. And then which offices and staff are going to be involved? Which ones can post or have access to the account? This is pretty important to make sure that only authorized people have access, okay? These are the people covered by your policies and procedures, and others are not. And we'll talk about those in a bit in just a moment. Okay, so we're talking about managing social media. Well, one way you do it is you create some policies and procedures. Now, we hope you already have a lot of these policies and procedures in place, or something you can kind of graft onto some social media examples for policies and procedures. But if not, you want to remember to do it as quickly as possible, something in place, because these policies and procedures, these are the big overarching things. They tell everyone what they can and cannot do, who can post, who cannot, what content is allowed. Once it's written and they do something wrong by not following these policies, it's up to the individual for not following the rules that have already been established in the policies. It is not on necessarily the local government or a state agency, because they have written up those policies and procedures. Here's the problem, okay? Without these policies, it's kind of the wild, wild west out there. People do not officially know what they can and cannot do. Yes, we can use common sense on what should be allowed and what shouldn't be, but legally, without those policies and procedures, people don't know officially what is allowed and what is not. Now, the procedures, those provide instructions on how to do this. They're really more like step-by-step instructions of how to do everything related to social media. You can provide who to contact to put up content, who to contact when there is a reply, and also what to do when there is a reply that leads to some kind of follow-up or maybe some kind of issue. You want to make sure that all of this is, written down and people have an understanding. Okay, so we have some examples here of some policies we think that are important. These are some basics that we recommend. This is for more your public relation people, your public relation staff. It helps keep things under control. So what are the appropriate types of content for social media? Now, again, this should be a no-brainer. What is allowed and what is not? But again, without writing it down, the water's going to get a little bit murky. You want to make it clear what is allowed and what is simply not. This becomes more confusing when dealing with, as Sarah said, dealing with maybe political posts or one tied to an individual's campaign. That can become a bit more confusing if somebody sets up their own and not necessarily the official one. How posts are developed. What is creating content? Who is creating content? Is it a single person? Is it a department? Is it kind of everybody across the board? What is the process for approving posts? Who needs to review the posts before they go and, greet the world? Who is responsible for and allowed to post content? You always want to have somebody higher up in management to authorize the posts ahead of time to avoid confusion and possible issues later on. Who will own and moderate the official accounts? That's kind of tied to the one above, but you also sometimes need somebody with a little bit more technical expertise as well. You want to make sure that they have the authority to get into those accounts. Will user interaction be allowed? Typically it's allowed, but if so, then what level of interaction and when do you, maybe possibly cut it off if it becomes problematic? Are you allowed to do so? All of that has to be discussed. How often will updates occur? Yeah, are you thinking maybe every few days, a week, maybe more, maybe less? All of that has to be discussed. And then evaluating the continued value of the platform. Look it over after time and see if it's worth, putting your time and effort into. Are you getting enough out of it? Other than maybe some likes and thumbs up and some follows. Now, these policies are more for your records management individuals, and these need to be, very specifically addressed as well. Respond for discovery or FOIL or information requests. What if somebody FOILs your post? How do you make that available? You need to manage the retention of the social media records. You need to have policies in place to make sure you don't lose the records you create. And we'll talk about specific records retention in a moment. And then what about permanent preservation if it's needed? You need to determine how long you need to keep them. But if the retention schedule says it's permanent, then yes, it's permanent. What do you do to make sure that you can retain that information? Even if, Facebook or Meta disappears, how are you going to make sure you still have that? And then how about removing records from a platform? Now, this is a whole conversation about how and when to remove records. Do you still keep a copy for retention, even if you remove it, for example? Maybe there's a big issue about your policies and procedures like we had with COVID recently, and everybody's setting up policies for that. Maybe the answer is yes, because of a larger historical aspect. Or maybe if there's a problem, you want to keep it as an example of what not to do for future administrations. And yes, we can provide, we have some examples of some policies that you can use. There's the New York State Office of Information Technology Services policy, which you can see a link here, right here, and that will certainly help. It's a pretty, it's a good policy. It's a good starting point to help develop your own. We can always share that with you. There's also the Federal Chief Information Officer Council, and they have some samples of policies as well that we can definitely share. And at this point, I will turn it over to Sarah.
While that slide is still up on the screen, if you have an awesome policy that you would love to share and would be okay with sharing with other governments, please feel free to share that with us. Send it to our email. We're always looking for examples of awesome policies for other people to model theirs on and to learn from ourselves. All right, here's the tough questions. How can I tell if my social media has records in it? Well, so any information that is created or received in the course of business is potentially considered to be a record, as we've previously stated. So if it has unique content and it is the only place that that information is available, that you wrote that the only place that the announcement that your building is closed for the day is going to be on your Facebook page, that is potentially a record because that is unique content. Includes interactions with the public because you've got somebody going, please help me, I need help with something, can you help me find something? That could be considered a record. Is it conducted in the course of business? It's right there in the definition of a record, and that's pretty much everything that you're posting. That means it could potentially be a record. Was it created or received by a government agency or local government? Guess what? You! Yes, you! You, as an employee of a government entity, are a part of a government entity. So potentially, yeah, it could be a record. And does it document your government's functions, policies, decisions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Who, what, when, where, how, who? Yeah, that could make it potentially a record. So you really do have to evaluate what's being posted. And again, it's what's on the social media might not necessarily be the record or be the record copy, but you need to be aware of that.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. So the question that we get most often, right? The one we hear, how do I figure out the retention of these? You know, Sarah's explained what is record. So now how do we figure out how long we need to keep these? Well, you need to determine what is a record. That means you need to figure that out by looking at the retention schedule and just looking to see what lines up according to the listed record series in the schedule, whether you were using the local government schedule, the LGS-1, or the state agency general schedule. You need to kind of try to see what makes sense. And it's important to remember that just like email, all right, there's no single retention for the records in social media. It's tied specifically to the creators and the content. We'll have some examples on the next slide to give you a bit more idea of what we're talking about. So you have to figure out which copy is the official copy, all right? If you post something to social media but have another copy someplace else, then that's only going to be considered the duplicate. You know, if it's considered the duplicate, you only have to keep it as long as needed. You want to match to that existing retention item. As I said, you take the record you have and you do your best to match it to the LGS-1 or the state general schedule. And you focus on this whole idea of function and content. So what department or general area does this record come from? Is it public relations, maybe Department of Public Works, transportation, maybe the Department of Health? Then you can focus on the content. What is being said and what kind of interaction are you receiving? What kind of interaction are you doing? So we have some specific examples that we think everybody's probably going to run into. Uh, typical records that you're going to find. When you have direct messages with constituents, it can be considered, general correspondence. So you need to, figure out where exactly that falls. Using the LGS-1 item 53 and the appropriate item for your agency, it would go under general correspondence. It could be in the general schedule or it could be an agency specific RDA. So you need to kind of look into that, but there's some other examples as well. Press releases, publications, complaints, or requests for public services. We'll have some more specific information right now on the next slide. Hey, look at that. All right, so there we have, say we have an example announcement of a new staff hire. Well, press releases are covered by the LGS-1 item number 68. You can check it out. And then the general schedule, the item's number 90336. So that's something, fairly typical. How about a copy of an annual report? Well, the copy on social media should be considered a duplicate and is covered by the LGS-1 item number 58 for duplicates. And then the general schedule of 90388. And what about a user request for more information, like on a Facebook posting or something like that? Well, here we're talking about it's covered under the LGS 1 under number 77 and the general schedule under 90329. Yeah, I'm sure you're going to find other examples that don't fit under these, nice categories, but these are the basics, the ones we expect everybody kind of run across. When in doubt, you can always contact your RAO or the retention unit in Albany. We have the contact information at the end for contacting anybody in records management, and we are happy to help you. That's kind of the reason we're there, is when you can't answer a question, whether it's retention or anything with records management, we're happy to help. So when you run into something you don't know the answer to, that's when you ask us. All right. So there are challenges on maintaining social media that's a little bit different than all the other records. Sarah kind of alluded to them before and talk about them in a little bit more detail. The problems is social media is usually a third-party platform, okay? It means you have no control whatsoever over their use policies, no guarantee on long-term availability, and there may be some kind of technical compatibility change without warning. Everyone has probably had the experience, unfortunately, of an update totally destroying, a regular familiar function or making it difficult to access something. In the end, that third party, that company is in control of the access that they allow. You do not, we as a state agency or local governments, you do not have control over the access in that case. It may require additional technical expertise to manage these records. So you want to make sure that you're going to have to work with your IT staff. You want to have someone with the knowledge of these platforms and how to pull information out of them when necessary. It's incredibly important. You may need to engage in some kind of external tools or services to get the information out. So you may need to work with someone else to ensure the information is not lost when the latest change comes along, especially if it has a long retention. You also have to pay attention. Now, when it comes to anything electronic and digital, it is always important to pay attention to how things are changing and what is the latest and greatest. How is the current social media environment evolving? You need to remember, all of this is changing. All of this is constantly changing and evolving into something different. Companies change owners, models of business changes, platform changes. You don't want to get left behind. You don't want to be the only one who's still, using a MySpace account when everybody else is using something else. What's popular today may not be popular tomorrow. We all know about this. That's why you have to think about not just what you are using, but also how that information out. How can you download your content? Or, do you have to print it out to make sure that you're maintaining it? All of that matters. Now, we know it's a ton to think about, but as Shara will say, it is not hopeless.
All right, so you may be thinking at this point, man, I am doomed. I am doomed, 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 doomed. And I am here to say, no, you are not doomed. You are going to be okay. I am not saying that you do not have work that you may need to do, but you will be okay. I promise. So to try to get a handle on this, first, you just need to know what's being used. Talk to your units, talk to your IT folk, talk to your PR folk. Find out what social media tools are currently being used, how they're being used, and what they're thinking about moving to or adopting if they're looking at new tools, because there's a couple of new ones out there right now. Be aware of what those service contracts do and don't allow. What does their use policy look like? What does the records ownership policy look like? And the data mining policies look like? Because there's some interesting things that are in those contracts when you sign up for them. Because depending on what service you're using, what your settings are within the service. Some of them do say, hey, we're allowed to reuse your content for various purposes in terms of promotion, um, advertising, that sort of thing. So you want to make sure that you know what you're signing up for when you're signing up for these and what rules are in place for that. And if it doesn't work for you, what can you do to change that? And then, if possible, identify those ways to manage that social media records early on. If you know that you're going into a new service, a new tool, figure that out right now. Figure out what sort of records are likely to be on there. If you're already using it, and I think for many of us we already are, what do you need to be able to do to get that information out? What do you need to be able to do to manage the information? Where do the official copies of all of these records live? Like I was saying, platform terms of service are really important to be aware of. You can't just sign up for something and assume it's going to always be okay. Um, and because they may not have what exactly you think is going to be in there, and you may find that they change over time. And this is true for any third-party service you're using. So if you're using a cloud service to store your records, these are also similar things that you want to be aware of. What sort of security is in place for those records? What does the storage requirements look like? Will they store anything that you're putting up there? Will they delete it after a certain period of time? Do you only have a limited amount of storage available? Where is it being stored? Is it being stored in the United States? Is it not? Who has ownership and access to the records that you're putting up there, the information that you're putting on your social media sites? How easy is it to access those records, pull them out, transfer them to a new service if appropriate? And what sort of disaster mitigation do you have in place in case something goes horribly, horribly wrong? One of my favorite social media tools that I didn't post on but I liked to use was Vine, and Vine is long since gone, although remnants of it exist on reposts of those videos elsewhere. But when Vine went down, if you didn't get your videos off of it, they're gone. What do you do in situations like that? There are ways to archive and capture your social media, and that's going to vary from service to service what the best option is. But if you choose to archive your records, to pull them off of the service and maintain a copy, or capture them and maintain a copy off of the third-party service so you have control over them, you really want to start thinking about how you want to do that. How long do you need to hold on to those records? How often do you need to do this archive or capture action? What is the volume of content that you are going to be getting from this, and how are you going to manage that? If you are looking at, infrequent captures, how stable is the system that these records are already on? And what tools can be used to extract the data? Because this is going to vary, again, from service to service as to what's available and what you need. Looking at some of these, some of them already have a archive tool built right in. For example, X has a archive tool built right into it. I've downloaded my account a couple of times to make sure that I have the most updated version of it. Some tools don't have those built in at all, in which case you need to maybe look at a web harvesting tool or some commercial tools that do that work for you. The most low-tech solution is to print them to PDF or paper. Bring up the screen, your social media on the screen, take a screenshot, and put it on into your Word file so you can save it that way. It really depends on the tools that you're using, your level of technical expertise, and the resources that you have yourselves. And I should note, we have a little disclaimer at the bottom there. We mentioned a couple of tools and brands, companies that make tools for this sort of thing. We don't endorse anything in particular. We just want you to know what's available out there. So this is a lot of information, and we know that. We have just thrown a whole bunch of information to you. If this is something that you have not considered before, you may be feeling a little bit overwhelmed, and I am sorry for that, but it's going to be okay. Start simple. First and foremost, just figure out what you have, figure out what you're dealing with, figure out what's running around your government so that you can start focusing on what needs to be dealt with. This is going to take a little bit of time, just like everything else in records management. Nothing gets done in the first day you think about it, right? You know, whether it's an inventory, whether it's digitizing files, whether it's cleaning out your file room so you can dispose of records that are past their attention. Everything takes a little bit of time, so you're going to have to take a little bit of time to figure out what you're dealing with. But, you know, base thing, figure out what you have. Like Michael said, you really want to put together a team for this if you don't already have one to deal with your social media. And if you have a social media team that you're not on as a records person, maybe you want to get on that so that you can at least know what's going on. As things are evolving, make sure that you stayed up to date on changes, what's happened with the social media within your organization, and keep the team that has been created up to date on what you're doing with regard to records retention. You know, if you're setting up plans for archiving the records, or if you get a FOIL request or a discovery request is on the way, let them know so that they're aware of that. And ask for help whenever you need it. I mean, you've got your internal staff, your IT staff. You've also got us here at the State Archives. We can try to provide assistance to you as best we can when it comes to the records management aspects of managing your social media records. So with that, does anybody have any questions for us? I know Michael and I are very, very eager to answer every one that you have.
Hi, Sarah. Yes, we have a whole slew of questions.
Hooray!
Let me start from the beginning and begin at the start. So
I knew we were going to have a talkative group.
So from Cassandra, our fire department and police department have their own Facebook pages. Should every post have its own physical original records created?
Not necessarily. Um, So for records that are likely to have a very long retention period associated with them, so anything that would like be considered maybe a press release or something, more than just a couple of years, you might want to make sure that you have that offline copy that isn't on your social media. Um, because there could be important value associated with it. Alternately, you could figure out one of the strategies I mentioned with regard to archiving that information or capturing that information such that you have it in case you need it. And again, not considering the social media copy to be your official copy of those records. And I do want to stress, you don't have to have physical copies of these as well. You can have electronic copies of this information. Like if you have your press release as a Word file, there's no requirement that you print it out to paper for it to be an official copy of a record. So it doesn't have to be, but you want to analyze what information is being put out there and what retention periods are associated with it to make the best decisions.
Candace asks, is it okay to limit comments on posts?
Generally speaking, I would say yes. I don't believe that there is any requirement that you have to have your comments turned on. Um, but you also, and so you're going to want to talk to your PR folks and maybe even counsel to make sure that there's nothing there that's going to cause problems. But you also want to think about the tools that you're using. So while on Facebook you can turn off your comments, on Twitter or X, excuse me, people can retweet your comments and your post and add their own commentary to that. So you want to make sure you have a policy to address what you do in those situations.
Okay, from Taryn, for clarity on a record, I work for a college and we will send an email to our community about a campus update or alert. Sometimes we post a message on social media if the information would be helpful to external people like parents, contractors, etc. Would the message we post on social media be considered a copy of a record, and is that something we would need to archive?
I think that's going to depend on a couple of things. One, if the intent was it for it to always be public, then probably the social media copy is better to be the official copy because it's going to be seen by a larger audience. And if there's any question about that, there's any discovery actions or what have you, that they're going to want to have that. However, I mean, is the email the place where this was written? Is there a file that this was written and approved on before it went to email? Because that might be the better choice for the official copy, particularly if you knew it was going to be distributed widely. I'm going to go with an it depends.
Okay, so we have a A question from Roger. Would you consider SurveyMonkey and or MailChimp to be social media?
Um, Not really. They're tools that are used in conjunction with social media. However, they are not necessarily interactive communication tools in and of themselves, because largely they're one-way communication. You know, you're sending an email to folks with your newsletter, you're sending a survey to folks that you're trying to get a response from, but you're not trying to engage with them in that regard, necessarily. So I do think that there are retention schedule items out there that you need to address for those. You know, your newsletters are going to fall under publications. Off the top of my head, I'm less certain about how polls would be addressed. But you know, if you have a question about that, send us an email to the email address on the screen, and we are happy to look up that item for you.
Okay. And there was a comment by Sue, and Sarah, you responded to that, but I thought we could share this with this group, having to do with copies of policies. And she asked if we would share those policies. And Sarah, you said drop us a line. We'd be happy to. And then Sue asked about an email address. But you want to add to that, Sarah?
Yeah, no, if anybody wants to send us a policy, let us know if you're okay with us sharing it with folks. And if not, that's fine. We won't share it. We'll just use it for internal purposes. But if you can send it to the email address right on that screen, and if you're interested in seeing if we have any to share, also send an email to the address on that screen. We'll make sure that gets to the right person and you get that information.
Okay. And yes, that would be recmgmt@niced.gov. So just to kind of put that out there in the audio realm. Okay, another question here from Theodore. My town has the usual basic website, but as an unpaid local historian with no budget, I run my own historical website on a free site. I can and do back that up, and posting is limited to me. I also run a private Facebook group. Any members can post, but there is no way to back it up. I have gained a lot of valuable help and information through it, but it is a pain to run as spammers are always trying to slip in. In addition, I make historical videos, which are posted on YouTube and Rumble on my own accounts. I can and do I can and do back those up. However, what will happen to those records when I pass on? The town isn't really interested in keeping any more stuff because they have no room. What do these records fall under as far as preservation goes? They are almost all about things that happened long ago, but they were written up and posted recently. Then there are, of course, hundreds of emails. So maybe some comments on that, some thoughts from
I
either.
can take a stab at that one, Sarah.
Okay.
Uh, I'm sure you're pleased to hear that. Well, it sounds like that what you are creating, while it's interesting, I don't know if it falls under the realm of an official town record. Um, it seems because you mentioned a number of times that these are created under your accounts and not necessarily the town official accounts. So because of that, and they're not considered official town records, the preservation may be more what would be akin to something that would be kept for reference as to, as long as needed, as opposed to long-term retention. If it was created in the official capacity of as the town historian, though, then they could have a longer retention. So I hope that answers your question. I also noticed, Rich, just prior to that, there was another question, which you may have missed because you were kind of going along, which I'd be happy to address as well. Um, it was about the town board meeting videos on our server.
Okay,
Um,
yeah, I must have skipped that over. Sure,
yep,
go ahead.
Yep, no problem. They are downloaded to YouTube for as long as YouTube exists, or keep them there, but we do not have a contract with YouTube. Do these videos, apply on the LGS schedule? Um, Basically, if you are creating a video for town board meetings, which I'm assuming you're doing according to the open meetings law, then they would be required to be kept for 5 years, as far as I know currently. Um, that is, I believe, possible going to change, but that is currently what it has. So those need to be kept for 5 years because of that. In terms of The videos themselves, you would need to have a copy yourself, not necessarily just allowing the access to YouTube. I hope that helps.
Okay, I have a, let's see, question from Sam. Would you recommend locking social media posts after a certain time period to prevent additional posts that would require updating already stored records?
Potentially. It's hard to say universally yes because everybody has different needs associated with their social media and why they're using it. So it's something I would discuss with your internal staff and see what their thoughts are on it.
Okay, from Ashley, to go off on the limiting comments question, I read that the Supreme Court said government pages can allow all comments or allow no comments, but can't limit who can comment and who cannot. We want to turn the comments off, but Facebook no longer allows it. We can limit comments to only those who are tagged in a post. If we don't tag anyone, then no one can comment. However, to people looking at the post, it says, and I'll put this in quotes, the village of X limits who can comment on this post, unquote. Is this okay? Technically, no one can comment, but it looks like we are allowing some people to comment and others not.
Honestly, you're gonna have to check with your counsel on that one. It sounds, with regard to First Amendment rights, that sounds right. And I didn't realize that Facebook was not allowing you to turn off comments wholesale like that anymore. But yeah, that's something more for your counsel, unfortunately.
Okay, and a couple here from Pam. How should we handle it if elected officials already have unofficial, quote unquote, official social media accounts? And to add to that, how do we discourage newly elected officials from creating accounts?
I'll take this one, Sarah.
Okay.
Um, so the way you do that is having policies and procedures in place, because that makes it clear who has an official account and who has access to the official account for your organization and who does not. If you have something that's separate, that's entirely focused on one individual, then that really shouldn't be the official account. Like I said, you don't want to get into the area where you're putting up a lot of political posts, for example, or something like that on an official account, and you should make that kind of clear in your policies and procedures. That's the only way to really discourage either current or newly elected officials from creating accounts. You can allow them to continue that information from their own private accounts, but you don't necessarily want them putting that information in the official account for your organization. And that's why if you make that clear in your policies and procedures that there's that kind of separation, that's what you can point to. So you can talk to people who are currently a part of your organization or part of your government, your agency, or people who will be in the future.
And just to repeat our email again, since some folks may not be able to see it on the screen, it's a kind of an abbreviation of records management, and that's RECM as in Michael, GM as in Martin, T at niced.gov. And of course, like we always say, if you email us, you can send an email to the address that you received this information on the webinar, or you can go to our website. We'll get you to the right place.
The size of the font's on me, folks. I will do better on the next presentation, I promise.
Okay, and let's see. I have a question here from Crystalline regarding the TB meeting videos for 5 years. Can you tell me the LGS number?
Like many things, I don't have it off the top of my head, but if you contact myself through the records management account, I will be happy to pass that along to you.
Okay, and okay, Crystalline says thank you. And don't see any other questions, and we're down to about a minute, so maybe some closing comments from either Michael or Sarah before we say goodbye.
Sure, like this is a lot, and and like electronic records, it's going to be an ongoing amount of a lot because I don't see social media going away anytime soon. If anything, it looks like we're moving to more of a distributed system for at least the up and coming social media sites that may allow for a greater amount of control over ownership of your records. Um, but it remains to be seen how this develops. But keep an eye out because it's if you're into this sort of thing, it is exciting and interesting times out there.
And I would just like to add, thank you for coming today, and we hope that this has been helpful. And at the very least, you know who to contact when you have questions that are coming up, whether it's social media or anything else to deal with your records and records management.
Yes, thank you for coming today, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.